So this year I decided that my favorite film, at least at the moment, is Park Chan-wook's Oldboy. I'm not one for picking favorites, but every time I watch Oldboy, it's just as enjoyable, just as hilarious, and just as shocking as the first time I watched it. I recently had the opportunity to share this movie with a friend of mine. He loved it, and by the time it was over, he was left briefly speechless. But then he said something that stuck with me. "This is your favorite movie? What the hell is wrong with you?" Without getting into spoilers, the plot of Oldboy is pretty messed up. There are many parts of this film that I would not want anyone to walk in on me watching. But despite how sadistic these scenes are, I still love everything about this movie. I do wonder what that says about me, but I'm more curious about what that says about the directors of these kinds of films, and Korean cinema as a whole. For many, their introduction to Korean cinema was Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, a triumph of a production that was the first foreign language film to win Best Picture at the Oscars. This well-deserved victory puts it alongside some of the most revered films in the history of filmmaking. But compared to these other winners, this film feels noticeably more gruesome and confronting than what the Academy has loved in the past. And the funny part about that is, Parasite is on the lesser side of extreme in contemporary Korean cinema. This is not to say that all Korean films are weird and violent, but there does seem to be a common thread whenever I watch a popular Korean film. They're visually stunning, darkly humorous, and extreme. Extreme to a degree that is not often reached in Western cinema. Sure, we have slasher flicks and splatter films, but I feel like these films lack the nuance and expressiveness that comes with their Korean counterparts. And none of these extreme Western movies have ever been in the Oscar discussion. So what makes South Korean films different? Let's start with terminology. Most of the films I will be talking about here fall under the term Korean New Wave, a term that popped up in the 90s to describe an influx of South Korean movies with defining characteristics that separated them from other Korean films. Some common themes in the Korean New Wave movement include a focus on social disparities, injustice, and vengeance. Now, it must be said that this sense of restlessness in art is not entirely unique to Korea. Many, if not all countries, struggle with social inequalities, but the history and politics of Korea have been uniquely tumultuous in the past century. This has impacted the dominant ideologies of the South Korean people. Maria Pramaggiore and Tom Wallace write that ideologies may be invisible, yet they shape the world in important ways by influencing the actions of individuals and groups. They establish the parameters for what behavior and which identities are deemed normal and which ones are considered deviant. No art exists in a vacuum, so to understand Korean cinema now, let's take a brief dive into the modern history of Korea. In 1910 to 1945, Korea was under the colonial rule of Japan. For the Korean people, this was a long age of oppression. Many were mistreated, tortured, and killed for speaking out against their Japanese rulers. After Japan signed the surrender document at the end of the Second World War, this led to Korea being split at the 38th parallel, with the Soviets controlling the north and the US occupying the south. So for nearly half a century, Korea was in a state of constant unrest, and now that they were free from the control of the Japanese, their land was now being used as the forefront for a proxy war between two global superpowers. This brings us to the concept of Han. Some consider it impossible to translate this term into English, but Dr. Sandra Sohee-chi Kim, a professor of Korean studies at Stony Brook University, writes that Han is an essentialist Korean socio-cultural concept that is popularly understood as a uniquely Korean collective feeling of unresolved resentment, pain, grief, and anger. Han is often described as running in the blood of all Koreans, and the quality of Korean sorrow as being different from anything Westerners have experienced or can understand. With the repeated invasions of foreign powers and decades of oppression, many Koreans felt stripped of their identities. Han is a feeling that arose during the Japanese occupation, but this feeling would only develop moving into the Korean War. Without getting into too much detail, the outcome of this brutal conflict led to millions of Koreans being displaced. Some sources say that virtually all of Korea's major cities were destroyed. Entire towns, villages, and homes were now gone. But the most harrowing part of all of this is the estimated 2 million Korean civilians that were casualties during this conflict. It's not controversial to say that this was the darkest time in Korea's history, and forever shifted the psyche of the surviving Koreans. In 1953, the war was over, and while the dust had settled, Koreans were left with more national trauma than ever before. This feeling of unresolved sorrow, this Han, would continue. Moving into the late 50s, the peace had given South Korea time to rebuild and begin to forge their own identity. Aiding in this creation of a national identity were filmmakers who began to express themselves through the medium. This began the period dubbed the Golden Age of Korean cinema. While many of the films from this era can be described as melodramas, some filmmakers began to explore topics like female liberation or ideological disagreements after the war. In these earlier works, you could argue that the feeling of Han is present, but it is not quite as obvious. This was due in part to strict censorship laws surrounding South Korean cinema, and the fact that the conflict was still a very fresh wound for the people of Korea. But in the early 1960s, this censorship was briefly lifted, leading to seminal films like The Housemaid, a film that was different to what Koreans had seen before.
범죄 멜로드라마고 여성들의 섹슈얼한 어떤 욕망을 다루지만 동시에 아주 정치적이고 사회적인 그리고 그 당시 한국 그 사회와 계급이 막 변해가던 상황들이 아주 적나라하게 잘 담겨 있는 영화라고 생각이 들어요. 그 영화의 핵심 무대가 집이잖아요. 근데 그 2층 집이 나오거든요. 그러니까 그 당시 어떤 부자나 중상류층의 상징인데 2층 집에 산다는 건 2층 집에만 계단이 있죠. 1층 집엔 계단이 있을 수가 없죠. 근데 이 영화는 정말 1시간 반 내내 정말 계단이 많이 나오거든요.
The film explores class struggles, which would go on to become a reoccurring theme in Korean New Wave films. Bong Joon-ho cites The Housemaid as one of the key inspirations for the aforementioned Parasite, and it's not hard to see the influence. In the late 1980s, censorship laws in South Korea were further loosened. As the country was becoming more democratic, artists and filmmakers were given more freedom than ever before. At the same time, more Western films were being shown in local cinemas. It is debated when the Korean New Wave truly started, but with this change in government regulation, a new age of Korean cinema was clearly beginning, and the cinematic representation of Han was becoming more noticeable and explicit. So, with this cultural context, I'm going to try answer the question I proposed earlier. What makes Korean cinema different? It could be the unflinching depictions of violence, the morally ambiguous characters, or the portrayals of vengeance and the cost that comes with it. But on a deeper level, I believe that all of these facets are deeply rooted in Han and the complicated history that Korea has lived through. I think Bong Joon-ho puts it best.
개인과 사회, 개인과 역사가 충돌하는 일 자체가 많죠. 그래서 서유럽이나 뭐 예를 들어 오스트리아나 벨기에에서 나오는 영화 같은 경우는 다를 수밖에 없죠. 네. 그러니까 아까 얘기했다시피 좀 사회 자체가 격렬하고 여러 가지 격동과 극단적인 일들 많이 겪으면서 살아왔기 때문에 그게 자연스럽게 드러나는 것 같아요. 의식하지 않아도. 그리고 그런 자극이 강한 영화들을 또 관객들이 되게 쉽게 잘 받아들여요. 그러니까 음식으로 치면 막 토핑이나 소스가 엄청 강력한 것도 멕시칸 푸드에 막 거기다가 막 한국도 막 그 소스를 더 얹은 듯한 그런 강한 것도 쉽게 쓱 삼켜버리기 때문에.
Unlike your average Hollywood blockbuster, these are films that refuse to draw a clear line between right and wrong, and this directly challenges the dominant American storytelling model. And these storytelling models are highly reflective of how our cultures operate. During wartime, many Americans firmly believe that they are the good guys and that their opponents are the bad guys. Koreans seem to know that it's not always that simple. And that's why films like Parasite and Oldboy are so important. These are films that are loved across the world, and they aren't loved because of their Hollywood influences. They are instead loved for the uniquely Korean ideologies that run through the veins of these stories. Oldboy would not work as an American film, and hilariously, they tried, with a 2013 remake being directed by the undeniably talented Spike Lee. But this movie was a box office disaster in the US market. The wider American audience just couldn't relate with the themes of this film, and even with Spike Lee on the project, they couldn't translate the magic of Oldboy into a westernized story. And there are many films about class struggles in Hollywood, but none of them have reached the heights that Parasite did. This goes to show that we need different perspectives in filmmaking. It is the only way the medium can move forward. I'm not the first to notice the decline in popularity of traditional Hollywood films. People are bored of the same old superhero stories and are now branching out into different genres, different directors, and different countries. Parasite winning the Oscar makes me hopeful that filmmaking is moving in the right direction, and I'm excited to see how the extreme films of South Koreans influence cinema in other countries. Trying to understand Korean cinema through the lens of Korean culture has been very eye-opening, to say the least. I didn't expect to be learning so much about wartime history, but it is something that all countries have contended with to varying degrees and has influenced our art in one way or another. It makes me reflect on Australian art and how it was influenced by the effects of colonialism, but that's a can of worms for another day. I'll leave you with this quote from Old Boy that acts as a thematic through line of the story and many other Korean New Wave films. Even though I'm no better than a beast, don't I have the right to live? Thank you all for watching.